Judge has just delayed implementation of the Trump executive order that was freezing all government funding. It had originally been set to go into full effect right now, 5 p.m. Eastern. Joining us right now to tell us about this delay is MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. So tell us what the judge has decided and what that means, importantly, for people who are trying to access Medicaid portals or services.
Well, Nicole, let me first share with you what the judge decided, and then we can talk about what it means, because it's a little unclear what it might mean, and hopefully in the coming hours and days, we'll get a little bit more clarity about it. Judge Lauren Ali Khan of the D.C. District Court was ruling on an application made by a bunch of coalitions of nonprofits. And what she decided today was she doesn't have enough information, essentially, to enter a preliminary injunction or a temporary restraining order. The government's lawyer said none of these plaintiffs can tell you that they will be irreparably harmed. They can't point to which government programs, for example, they're dependent on, and how the cutting off of aid would prevent them from paying out their staffs or paying their rent at the end of the month. She said, given all of the allegations that have been made, given that they represent tens of thousands of nonprofits and other businesses dependent on aid, she'll enter what's called an administrative stay. That means until next Monday at 5 p.m., the OMB memo has been frozen, with one key exception. And here we get into what does this all mean? The freeze is only as to what is considered an open award, meaning if there is an existing distribution of funds from a given government program, that can't be touched. On the other hand, if an award hasn't yet been made from a particular grant program, then the Trump White House can put that OMB memo into effect and ask various agencies to report back to it in the way that they have in that original memo. So I still think there's some lack of clarity on what this means. But if you're a grant recipient, for example, in a state, you're a partner with a state that gets federal family planning grants, for example, and you're looking to get that check tomorrow, you're still going to get that check, assuming that you're an existing subgrantee, for example. If you are a partner with a nutrition program federally, you're going to get that check. The question is, are there major categories of federal aid, including in the foreign and international realm, where there aren't open awards and where this could be a real impediment to funding? We're going to have to wait to hear from people who know the appropriations process best, people who are really experts in OMB's processes and impoundment and in appropriations, to understand, are there real limitations on the administrative stay that Judge Ali Khan just granted?
Let me ask a dumb question. You may not know the answer to this, but David Jolly just said this is what Trump was impeached for the first time.
That's exactly right.
No understanding or respect for congressionally appropriated money. Is the judge saying that there might be some congressionally appropriated monies that Trump can take away?
I think what the judge is saying is, yes, there could be appropriated money that hasn't yet gone out the door as part of a grant program or an award program. And if that's the case, it couldn't be touched by the administrative stay. But again, she was reading her ruling orally from the bench. One of the things that was the hallmark of this debate between the DOJ's lawyer and the lawyer for these nonprofits was sort of an ambiguity about the whole enterprise, right? The memo went out yesterday, seemed to touch every federal program under the sun, with the exceptions of Social Security and Medicare. And then by midday today, NBC News' Garrett Haake was reporting to us that OMB had walked that back. It had issued a memo trying to clarify which programs weren't affected by it, but in ways that conflicted with the strict letter of the original memo. So I think one thing that is a gloss on this whole process is an uncertainty. And that's partially why I think Judge Ali Khan said, you know what? I need to press pause. I have the right under the Administrative Procedures Act, that's a federal law that governs agency action, to take that administrative stay to preserve the status quo while I'm evaluating whether or not a more lasting pause on this is warranted. And what the plaintiffs are asking for is either a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction. So let's consider this like baby steps, right? This is the baby stay, the baby pause. On Monday of next week, she'll hold a hearing at 11 a.m. to contemplate whether there should be a much longer pause. And then ultimately, maybe not, depending on what the administration does, a longer, lengthier trial as to whether or not the OMB memo was unlawful for all time.
Jake, the power of the purse is designated to Congress. It's part of the separations of power in government. It allows, not one part of government to have too much authority. It's how you stop a dictatorship or you stop a king. How does Congress feel about Donald Trump trying to, I'll use the term impoundment, even though the White House says it's not impounding. Can you explain what that term is and tell me how Congress feels?
Well, you and Garrett both know my love for the United States Congress. I love Congress. I think it has an important responsibility. Congress has completely abdicated, Katie. Republicans in Congress, let me be clear, have completely abdicated their role as a separate, equal branch of government. Mike Johnson, we wrote a couple weeks ago in Punchbowl News, is basically conducting his job as Speaker of the House as an aide of sorts to Donald Trump. Congress has absolutely no views of its own and waits for Trump to say what he's going to say and to weigh in how he will weigh in. That is no way for Congress to act. I mean, Congress has, and this is a much longer discussion, which will bore your viewers, but Congress has abdicated a lot of responsibility and power over the years, but this is a whole new level. Now, impoundment is, the question is, can the White House, can the administration, can any White House or any administration impound, withhold money that Congress has already appropriated and presidents have signed into law? The answer to that broadly is no. But listen, Katie, you're going to have a OMB director, that's the Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vought, who is, if confirmed, and we expect he will be confirmed, will test the outer limits of the law. He has said that. He does not have conventional views on the budgeting process. He said in his confirmation hearing, he was asked about that Impoundment Act, and he said President Trump ran against the Impoundment Act. Well, it's an interesting data point, Katie, but if the president doesn't like a law on the book, it's his responsibility to attempt, if he would like or she would like, to change said law, not to ignore it and said, I campaigned against it. That's not how our system of government works, although it might be how it works for the next 4 years. And furthermore, one more point here, you're just not, Katie, going to have a Congress that tests him with Republicans in the House, Republicans in the Senate, the majority in both chambers completely in debt and in awe, frankly, of Donald Trump. You're not going to have a legislative branch that stands up to Trump in any way.
Let me play that moment during the confirmation hearing for Russ Vought. This was Senator Patty Murray asking him whether he would enforce the Impoundment Act. And here, as you mentioned, here's what he said.
Will you, if confirmed, as director, faithfully follow the law, the Impoundment Control Act, yes or no?
Senator, we will faithfully uphold the law. The president ran on the notion that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. I agree with that.
Has the impoundment law ever been said to be unconstitutional by a court of law?
Not to my knowledge,
it
Senator,
has
no.
not. So it is the law of the land. I don't care what the president said when he was running. It is the law of the land.
Okay, hold on to that for 1 second. Garrett, you've got a statement from the White House on Medicaid.
Katie, you ask, we answer. The press secretary has just put out a statement on this saying that the White House is aware of these reports that the portals are down, but they say that payments are not affected. They're still being processed and sent, and that they expect the portal will be back online shortly. So they view this as unrelated to the spending pause.
I should say hi to everybody at the White House who's watching right now, and thank you for getting us that answer. All right, Lisa, let's talk about impoundment. Let's talk about what Russ Vought told Senator Patty Murray, what Jake was talking about. This seems like something... I mean, we might have thought that trying to overturn birthright citizenship would be first up for the Supreme Court. Seems like this might be first up for the Supreme Court.
It could be, but both share sort of a common DNA, which is that not only is it unconstitutional, but here you've got a statute that's being ignored, as well as constitutional text. You talked in the beginning about this is fundamental to our separation of powers. It's more than that. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the authority to appropriate money from the Treasury. That is a congressional responsibility and belongs only to the Congress. There's nowhere in Article 2, which is about the president, that says, you know what, he has a role here too. His role is solely with respect to vetoing acts of Congress when he can and when it's not overridden. This inherent authority over impoundment, which is what Russ Vought seems to be advocating, there is no constitutional text that would authorize that. They certainly will try to get the Supreme Court to endorse that, but there is no precedent in Supreme Court history that would give them reason to believe that that's where this court is going.
This is a Supreme Court, though, that has ruled in the past toward expanding executive authority.
Yes, and expanding executive authority all the way to the point where the president is immune for his unlawful actions while he is in office. And so this Supreme Court has given rise to what I'll call the elastic unitary presidency. The president has all powers, and he can sort of stretch the limits of what those powers are because he believes that there will be no consequences for him in doing so. Within the last 8 days, Katie, we've seen that theory being tested by him.
Jeremy?
Yeah, and stretch he will, right? I mean,
Right.
Trump has clearly embraced this view of the imperial presidency that, Richard Nixon and others saw themselves as having. I think Congress, in the kind of impotent stage that it has been in for the last decade or so, as Jake said, is going to be of no consequence to Trump and his desires to kind of flout the law and the letter of the Constitution as he sees fit. I think Congress, at least the Republican wing of it in the House and the Senate, has been completely cowed into submission by Trump, the political figure from whom they derive their political power and political relevance. So until, something miraculous happens and Trump somehow is no longer the popular figure that he is with the Republican voting base, I think you're going to see this kind of unitary executive act as it wishes to interpret the Constitution. One thing as a point of contrast to where other Republicans are actually standing up to their chief executive, something very interesting is happening in Florida right now, where the Republican legislature has told Ron DeSantis, no, we are not coming back to session on your terms. DeSantis had called a special legislative session, and they said, nope, we're not going to do that. You are encroaching too much on our powers as a legislative body. And we're not just going to hand that over.
Why
to
do
you.
they feel empowered to do that? Is that because Donald Trump has defenestrated Ron DeSantis and they feel like he's weak and there's blood in the water?
I think that's absolutely it. I think because you have the Republican leadership in the state legislature there saying that it basically is acting with, I don't know if the consent of Trump is the right word, but in the spirit of Trumpism.
Huh. All right, I want to put up on our screen. This is some details of what OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is asking for on the agencies that are currently having a pause, who knows for how long, in funding. This is school meals for low-income students, the WIC, nutrition program for pregnant women and infants, wildfire preparedness for the Department of the Interior. Don't need that. The Medicare Enrollment Assistance Program, USAID, foreign assistance, mine inspections, a reintegration program for homeless veterans. Garrett, is that all correct and up to date as we know it so far from the White House?
Well, conceptually, those are programs that could be affected, but the White House is trying to explain that they view this as pauses related to programs where they see things running afoul of these executive orders. So look at it through the lens of, DEI programs, for example. If they can go into one of those programs that you just put up on your screen and they find some kind of program that is spending money allocated to mine safety on, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, they want to see that paused. But they're trying to take some pains here, and I don't think they're doing a very good job of making it crystal clear that all of these programs are not put on pause, sort of pending proof that they're not spending money on this. It sort of works the other way. So I think we're going to have to see where the rubber meets the road on this, because the guidance they have put out is not clear, and it has created this enormous amount of confusion all around the country. At basically any agency that gets federal money, they're calling up their lobbyists and they're calling up the people that they know in Washington saying, what is going to happen to our checks to cover our rent and our payroll? And it's just not functionally clear right now.
Jake, is there any worry that maybe some of the folks that are affected by this are folks that voted Republicans into office, voted Donald Trump into office, and that there might be some blowback down the line?
Yup. I mean, listen, programs like LIHEAP, which is a subsidized home heating program, Republicans, Democrats from New England, from northern states, benefit from that. That has been a point of tension on Capitol Hill for some time, as Republicans have tried in the past to cut away on at programs like LIHEAP. I mean, it's an interesting contrast, Katie. I've been up here in Doral, Florida, at the House Republican Retreat for the last 2 days, and Republicans have been talking about how they've completely changed the face of the Republican Party. They're digging in deeper with constituencies they had never seen before, lower income, working class, all these other, groups that they had no success with in the past. Many people in many different groups benefit from government programs that they are trying to slash. And I just think, and remember, when they go in the next couple of weeks to craft a budget, which will unlock this process to pass the tax cuts that Donald Trump wants, they're going to have to make tough decisions about what they are willing and unwilling to cut. And every Republican, save one, will need to sign on the dotted line and vote for that. That is where the rubber meets the road. Right now, they could say, oh, we don't know what this is going to impact. The White House is saying this, you're saying that. Okay, fine. But when the rubber meets the road in the next couple months, they are going to have to make a call whether they are comfortable cutting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, LIHEAP, WIC, all these government programs, which, by the way, the administration has said they're not going to cut a number of these programs. But we'll see. This is a very complicated process, and it comes time where you have to put your name next to a vote.
A stark warning from Caroline Kennedy to U.S. senators about her cousin, RFK Jr., who she does not think should be confirmed as Health and Human Services Secretary.
I've known Bobby my whole life. We grew up together. It's no surprise that he keeps birds of prey as pets, because Bobby himself is a predator.
She wrote this letter to a group of senators and alleges that her cousin is, quote, addicted to power, has given hypocritical advice on vaccines, led family members, quote, down the path of addiction, and describes disturbing scenes at the places where he's lived.
His basement, his garage, his dorm room were always the center of the action, where drugs were available, and he enjoyed showing off how he put baby chickens and mice in a blender to feed to his hawks. It was often a perverse scene of despair and violence.
Let's bring in the reporter who broke this story, Jacqueline Alemany of The Washington Post. Mark McKinnon is also with us, former advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain and creator of The Circus. So, Jacqueline, I don't ever remember reading a letter quite like this. Help us understand some more of the things that are in here and why she ultimately decided to write this letter.
Yeah, Chris, thanks so much for having me this afternoon. This was a pretty searing and devastating letter that Caroline Kennedy, the former ambassador to Australia under former President Biden, sent to Democratic and Republican lawmakers who are going to be confronted with her cousin's nomination hearings starting tomorrow and on Thursday, essentially warning them, advising them to vote against her cousin. She, as you know, was reluctant to get involved in this conversation. She did not comment on RFK's politics or involvement with his own campaign and the Trump presidential campaign during the campaign period. She very reluctantly commented on RFK's politics as it relates to vaccines and the public health sector at an event in Australia in November. But as she lays out in this letter to lawmakers, she did not want to get involved in having to discuss the lives and challenges that her family members face, but felt compelled to do so because of how well she knows RFK and what she knows about public health as well, having served and participated in some of the public efforts around vaccination and public health. She not only lists some of his challenges early on in his career, but says that he is essentially, she calls him a hypocrite for advocating that families of sick children not vaccinate their children while his children are vaccinated. She also says that he seeks to enrich himself through propagating some of these anti-vaccine beliefs, such as refusing to recuse himself from a lawsuit that he's filed against the HPV vaccine, citing a New York Times report that the Washington Post has not independently confirmed. But there are a list of things she goes through in this letter about why exactly she opposes the nomination. It might not necessarily dissuade any Republicans, but there were a few Democrats who were on the fence that could really firm up opposition from them.
She does point out in this letter, Mark, that there are 28 cousins, and obviously both she and RFK Jr.'s dads were assassinated. They share that. And there's another part of the letter that I found particularly telling. She writes, Bobby continues to grandstand off my father's assassination and that of his own father. It is incomprehensible that someone who is willing to exploit their own painful family tragedies for publicity would be in charge of American life and death situations. It does go on, including much of what was explained by Jacqueline. But let me ask you, do you see this having an impact?
I really don't. I mean, it's no surprise to anybody that the Kennedy family is across the board opposed to Robert Kennedy's nomination. But that's why he's such a prized asset for the Republican Party. This would be like a member of the Bush family being in the Biden cabinet. The question is, will it have any effect on confirmation? And the fact is, it's certainly not going to have an impact on any Republicans. In fact, just the opposite. There is the notion that there could be some Democrats out there willing to vote for Kennedy. But I don't see that any of the information is particularly new. I mean, it's new that Carolyn Kennedy's coming out and being so vocal, but there's nothing in that letter, at least that I heard, that's particularly newsworthy in terms of information that we didn't already know about Robert Kennedy. The thing that I find interesting is that abortion policy is not just a big health policy for Republicans. It's like the biggest major policy initiative across the board of anything that Republicans care about. So you'd think that that would be a mitigating factor in support for Kennedy. And yet there's not a single Republican pro-life organization, with the exception of the one that Mike Pence leads, that's come out against Robert Kennedy. And even very pro-life senators have said they're satisfied with Kennedy's remarks that he may have had differences in the past, but he is 100% across the board in alignment with Donald Trump's policies on this issue.
You did mention that conservative advocacy group that is headed by Mike Pence, and they actually just today put an ad out. Let me play a little bit of that.
RFK Jr. is a Democrat plant, a radical left liberal. A lot of people think that Jr. is a conservative. He's not. He's more liberal than anybody running on the Democrat side.
So whatever, 6-7 months ago, they're playing what Donald Trump had to say very disparagingly against RFK Jr. back then. But I think to your point about abortion, and there were a lot of folks when Kennedy was first selected who thought, well, his pro-abortion stance will tank him with conservatives. What do you really think changed? Or is this just we're going to give Donald Trump what he wants?
Well, I think that people have looked at the other confirmation process and they've realized that if they don't get on board, there's going to be consequences. Trump has made that very clear. But I think they also really like the idea of having the most iconic name in Democratic history, Kennedy, on the Trump team. I mean, they love that notion. And of course, his vaccine background is absolute alignment. By the way, it's interesting today to see that it was reported that in Kansas, the largest tuberculosis outbreak in history just was reported. So it's interesting what's happening on the vaccine front. But again, that's very much in alignment with MAGA voters, and I think a lot of them like that and are willing to put aside his past history on abortion just for that reason.
Jacqueline Alemany, great reporting as always. Mark McKinnon, always good to have you on the program. Thanks to both of you.
Our top story is all about a line that I've told you will be important in this era. Between the big things, and there are some big things going on, and the little things that they want you to believe are big things. Allow me to explain. President Trump, right now, is doing something that could be a big thing if it worked, if it happened, if it actually goes into effect. And many people care about it, and the government is dealing with it, and the courts will deal with it, and we've been covering it. Other channels, other outlets are covering it. No one's saying this is something to ignore. But if you keep your head on straight and the facts in front of you with a little knowledge of law and history, this could end up being a little thing, even though he wants you to think it's very big. What we're talking about is a path that could lead to another relatively quick legal defeat for Donald Trump. And he had one last week, you remember, on the citizenship issue, an initial court setback, because Donald Trump is doing a lot with these orders. every president can sign executive orders, but if you sign orders that aren't really in their structure orders, they're more like what a law would be or what the Constitution would be. Calling it an order doesn't mean you override existing laws or the Constitution. Even if you haven't brushed up on civics in a while, you probably remember that. And so Donald Trump right now is doing something where we already have a Constitution and a lot of legal precedent that says this is Congress's power, not his. So before I get into the weeds of it, just keep that in mind. We're talking about something that is a government power, but it's Congress's power, which is spending, not the president's power. So Donald Trump has said he wants to just freeze something that involves spending, all the federal grants. So Washington Post, right, it's news. I'm not saying we would ignore it. It's actually, if he got away with it, it would be a huge thing. But this is a plan. This is an order where the White House wants to pause federal grants. You could see the headline ending with confusion because Congress, once it grants and authorizes money, that doesn't just get pulled by the White House. Now, the White House, under Trump, says they want to align federal spending with presidential priorities, meaning they might want to reverse or seize money that Congress, under law, and a previous president already signed. And that's not how it works. You don't usually get to do that. Maybe some rare exceptions, but you don't usually get to do that. I also want to tell you, in fairness to Donald Trump and his legal team, the same plan, the written plan, includes a statement that they want to do it within practicable law. So they're saying a plan that goes beyond the law, and then a smart lawyer put in there within the law. And then we're going to battle it out. In the meantime, though, when one branch of government just announces it's going to take all the spending power, which could amount to a lot of money, from the other branch of government against the Constitution, well, that kind of thing does spark immediate, far-reaching, and sometimes even ferocious responses.
This decision is lawless, dangerous, destructive, cruel. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional.
This president has exceeded his authority. He has violated the Constitution.
The chaos that this is creating is horrendous.
People should think about the mom who doesn't know if she can get her kid to childcare today.
If you drive on a road, you're impacted. If you get health care, you're impacted. If your children are being educated in our schools, you're impacted.
He is breaking the law.
This is what a king does.
Now, you can see a lot of the focus there, understandably, is on what the president can and can't do. And you saw the faces and voices of people criticizing this or saying it's flatly unlawful, unconstitutional. But that would be true regardless of who did it or who the president is. Here in the news, our job would be to tell you if any president, if you had a very liberal president that said they were just going to seize all the money for liberal priorities, maybe redirect it to climate change without getting climate change funding from the Congress, I would tell you they can't do that traditionally. And people could debate it. That's what's happening here. Now, this order is very broadly written. As I mentioned, it sort of has this extra caveat language, within the law. But what it does is break constitutional law. The impact, though, could be huge. You might say, okay, we're talking what, millions, billions? We're talking tens of billions? Remember, we had an election about the economy and what the government can or should do to help people who are struggling. Well, this could actually cover, seize, or misappropriate trillions, that's trillions of dollars in spending with a T, going to things that people around the country, red state and blue, need. Things that even bipartisan laws have agreed upon are essentials, including state and local funding, right, which can go to red and blue states alike, child care, shelters for the homeless, school lunches. Now, many Republicans said that, hey, it's the honeymoon period, and a lot of what Trump's been doing, they either say okay, or they're silent, or they say a version of okay, like, we need to look at the details, I need to look more at it, but they're not exactly sounding like what I just showed you. But others, when you talk about someone who's elected to Congress, and their whole job is passing these laws that fund things, and a lot of the budget debate is the moral debate. Do you want to fund health care or not? Do you want the taxes high or low? All of that is congressional spending stuff, more or less. Some Republicans looked off guard.
I've heard from people in my district this morning asking me about it. And all I can say right now, I hope it's short-lived. There's no reason for the disruption.
No, he's not overstepping his bounds. And in fact, we're going to try to stop the waste, fraud, and abuse.
Is it legal
I do not know. I'm not a lawyer, but it was appropriated, so I don't see how they can just stop it.
That is a respectful way of saying it sounds illegal, because, again, think about it. If any president could do what Trump did, then most of Congress's spending and budgeting would be meaningless, because you'd just have what they call the king-like retroactive veto of everything that came before. And there are real-world consequences, because some of this has not been done well. I'm not saying that as an opinion. I'm not saying that to be mean-spirited. But government involves competence and execution. If you want to do a Pentagon program to get planes built and fly them around the world, or you want to try to give medical care through the various complex systems in the United States, you need people who know how to do it. And there was signs today that this was feeding confusion with people involved, either not knowing what they were supposed to do or not doing it effectively. Medicaid payments to states, again, red and blue, plenty of Republican states get that money, rely on it, frozen. And immediately, officials and experts were saying this was a problem, a snafu from the Trump freeze. I want to report for you the Trump White House denies that, meaning they say acknowledge the problem. They're even saying the payments will be back soon. They say it's not related to this other freeze. So that's some of that debate. State attorneys general already taking Trump officials to court over this, and other groups that are affected, small businesses, nonprofits, also going to court. So this is a very big thing, even though I've told you that in the long run, there's no reason to think the courts of the Constitution would allow this. Where does that take us? The big part, like I told you, is that this can matter in the interim. And a heck of a lot of people who aren't billionaires and aren't pocketing crypto money have to spend time, energy on this instead of something else, and the uncertainty of that, which businesses don't like. So in that sense, this seems negative and unfair to a lot of people, as I mentioned, in states red and blue. This also, though, for Trump, if you're covering the politics and the showmanship, looks like he has picked another battle that I just showed you some Republicans seemed confused by, which could lead to a second major loss in the courts quickly. Remember, it was just last week, his first week in office, where another mechanism that was executive only, he didn't go to the Congress, he didn't compromise, but he announced that he wanted to change the citizenship clause in the Constitution's 14th Amendment, was shot down by Thursday in court. That process will play out. It'll take longer, but it was quite the setback. This could see the same result. And that Judge, a Ronald Reagan appointee, called that order blatantly unconstitutional. This is all happening now, so we don't have any final ruling on what they're trying to do to seize the congressional spending power. But late today, going into the basically 6 p.m. hour in Washington, just moments ago, a federal judge indicated they're at least going to delay the start of this new claimed spending order at least until Monday. And then again, lower courts and perhaps ultimately the Supreme Court will have to decide, are they going to let this president rewrite the Constitution itself? Congress, in both parties, certainly would not like the idea of having some random politician seize 200-plus years of the spending power precedent. So, big and little. The stakes are big. The results in the short term are big for, as I said, people affected. But the president, the outcome, the result for his administration, could be making him look very little. He's drawing attention to one of the powers that the Constitution in writing very clearly gives to Congress. He's drawing attention to his powerlessness, to his supporting role in that issue. And again, that's not a criticism. It's not specific to this president. All presidents deal with the Congress in this way. That's why when you see those signing ceremonies and the budget debates and the debt ceiling debates, we had one of those in December, remember? It always involves Congress. Most people know that. Is this smart strategy? Is it flooding the zone? Or is it a mix of things where someone who has gotten in the habit of telling everyone he never wants to hear no, thus has to be told no in public, in court, smacked down like he was Thursday, rather than doing a more orderly style of governing?
Joining us now is NBC's Aaron Gilchrist at the White House, Kendall Adian at the Department of Justice, and April Ryan, Washington correspondent for Black Press USA. Aaron, walk us through what funding is paused exactly, and does the president have the power to do this if Congress is supposed to hold the power of the purse?
Yeah, so Anna, I should be clear about this. There's still a lot here that is not very clear as it relates to this memo that was sent from the Office of Management and Budget to federal agencies late yesterday. As we understand it, this memo directs these agencies to pause the disbursement of funds for financial assistance programs. It doesn't specifically identify in this memo which programs that refers to. It did say specifically that this does not include disbursements for Social Security and Medicare or direct payments to individuals. But that sort of leaves up in the air what exactly this does mean as it relates to the many programs that receive all or some of their funding from these grant and loan programs that are run by the executive branch of the federal government. So, for example, if you have programs that are funded, if you have people who receive assistance through state programs or nonprofit organizations, and the money comes from the federal government to those organizations or state local programs, that money flow from the federal government would be paused if this memo, according to this memo, that would go into effect at 5 o'clock this evening. And so those efforts, whether they be housing or food assistance programs or some education-related programs, those things would cease to receive that money from the federal government. Your question about whether the president has the authority to do this, you're right. Congress does control the purse strings, and as money is appropriated by Congress, it is supposed to be doled out by the executive branch. The president, Anna, does have some flexibility with that, but it's really not clear right now whether he has the ability to just say stop for any extended period of time.
April, a lot is not clear here. We don't know the full scope of this decision yet, and again, the actual powers the president has. But we do know people get federal aid in the form of loans, food aid, farm assistance. If we don't know the full extent of what's on pause, how much confusion does this create?
It creates a lot of confusion. And Anna, today we're going to find out. We're going to try to parse through the confusion today at 1 o'clock in the White House briefing room with the press briefing, rather, that's going to happen. What we do know is that the president is very much an anti-DEI, anti-woke person. Part of this loan and grant money is said to be pulling back from woke efforts and also the Green New Deal, something that the president doesn't like. And then think about this. As we hear about this money, this grant and loan initiative to stop, what will it do to people who are depending on that money for, be it housing, be it what have you? This could cause a lot more confusion than just saying, I'm going to stop a program. It could really mean a matter of how do I live versus, if I can or can't live, off the monies that I was supposed to get. So this is a really, really, really big deal for a president who's very much anti-DEI, anti-transgender, anti-climate change. We'll just have to wait until 1 o'clock to see what the White House has to say about all of this.
And Aaron, this memo was signed by the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget. Trump's pick to lead that office is Russell Vought, someone deeply involved with Project 2025. What do we know about his plans, if confirmed?
And someone who has served in this role in the first Trump administration. We don't have specific details about his plans moving into this position. We know that there was a contentious confirmation hearing for Mr. Vought last week, I believe it was, where he was asked questions about whether he would, for example, spend the money that Congress had appropriated for different programs. And he wasn't inclined to give a direct answer on some of these things, saying things like he would wait to see what the policy priorities were of President Trump, and he would act accordingly to his policy priorities and in accordance with the law. But he did talk about the president's desire to see fiscal accountability come back, as he often says, into the federal government. And he was asked if he would direct agencies to withhold grant funding. That was one of the questions that was put to him, whether he would withhold grant funding based on political differences with President Trump. And he indicated that he would make decisions based on the law, based on priorities from the president, not necessarily on political inclinations. Anna.
Aaron Gilchrist, thank you. We'll let you keep digging on what's impacted here. Ken, the Justice Department also made some news late yesterday announcing it fired several career lawyers who worked on investigations involving Trump. So do we know who exactly was fired, and what is the broader impact of this purge?
Good morning, Anna. The impact is deeply significant. We don't know all the identities nor the number of people fired. Around 40 career prosecutors worked for Jack Smith. So it's not clear how many we're talking about here. But this came in a letter from Acting Attorney General James McHenry, who summarily fired these people and said that essentially they cannot be trusted to carry out the president's agenda because they prosecuted the president. And the letter accused them of participating in the weaponization of the Justice Department. Important to say, there's been no evidence that has surfaced that has suggested that there was anything inappropriate or biased about the work of Jack Smith's office, which was carried out mostly by career prosecutors like these people we're talking about. And there really isn't, we're going to use this word unprecedented a lot. We have never seen this before. It's one thing for the administration to reassign some senior career officials, which they have done, and told them that they need to go work on sanctuary cities, and some of those people have resigned instead of going to do that. That's within their prerogative. That's legal. What legal experts are telling us is these firings were not legal because these people have civil service protection. In order to fire them, you need to prove essentially that they were incompetent, that they disobeyed orders, that they did something inappropriate. And there's a whole mechanism to enforce that. So they're going to fight these firings before what's known as the Merit Systems Protection Board. They may win, but it probably won't matter in the end. The message was sent. And the message is if you mess with the Trump administration inside the Justice Department, they are coming after you.
April, we are just 1 week into this presidency, and when you look at the scope of President Trump's moves in recent days, from firing a slew of inspector generals, the firing of officials at the Department of Justice, as well as this pause on grants and loans, and that's just what's been done in the last 2 days. What do the last 8 days tell you about the next 4 years?
Hold on to your seats. I was talking to someone, an NAACP official. They were like, wait a minute, we're just 7 days? I said, no, 8 days into this today. And they were like, wow, what does this mean? It means that this president is true to what he said on the campaign trail, trying to fulfill things that he couldn't fulfill in the first term. This president is not a rights president. He is not a civil rights president. And that's one thing we know. We just have to see how it all plays out. But the question is, how much hurt will be doled out? I mean, just looking at that, the issue of the loans and grants, you also have research universities that money is going to be suspended with. And what will he constitute as woke versus not? I mean, you have a lot of HBCUs out here that get research money. They're looking to be an R1 research status institution. And will he say, oh, I don't want to do that anymore? And at one point, I remember when Donald Trump was president the first time, they offered to give more money to HBCUs. And then Steve Bannon came back and said, no, that's unconstitutional. But Congress gave the money. So there is a fine line here as to what is constitutional, what is woke, what is anti-DEI or DEI. We have to see what their definition of all of this is. But I expect there's going to be a lot of hurt for a lot of people between now and the end of this first term.
Ken, I wanted to ask you about another DOJ-related move. The president at least throwing out this idea yesterday that the United States should send American criminals overseas and simply pay foreign countries a small fee to hold them versus pumping, quote, massive amounts of money, end quote, into U.S. jails and private prisons. And he claims other countries do this. What are the facts, and could this go anywhere with the Justice Department?
I'm going to go out on a limb, Anna, and say that this would require a change in federal law. I don't believe that it's authorized as it currently stands. And look, obviously, the British Empire did this, and that was resulted in the creation of the country of Australia. It's not really done in modern times. I think this is an example, though, of the kind of thing that Donald Trump throws out there. Look, politicians are never going to lose popularity by promising to get tougher on criminals. But I think we need to keep our eye on the really significant things that they are doing here, including essentially going to war with law enforcement by firing career prosecutors and by pardoning people who committed violence against police officers, and by withdrawing the security details from former members of the administration who are under real threat from the Iranians. These are things that are happening. These are not just things that Donald Trump is throwing out there to get attention. So, but he's going to do that a lot. He's really good at it, and I think this is an example.
Ken, thank you so much. In April, at that same event yesterday, President Trump said this about a potential third term. Take a listen.
I've raised a lot of money for the next race that I assume I can't use for myself, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't know. I think I'm not allowed to run again. I'm not sure. Am I allowed to run again?
So he appeared to be joking there. But April, we've all learned over the years to take Trump's extreme rhetoric seriously. What do you make of that?
He said it over and over again. He's talked about a third term. And not only that, remember when he was running for office, he said, if you're a Christian, you don't have to vote again. I was like, what does that mean? So he's trying to push the envelope. Presidents have said in the past, the ones that I've covered over the last 28 years, I cannot run again because it's unconstitutional. Unless they change the Constitution, right now he's only going to be a two-term president. This should be under what our laws say and our founding fathers put in place. This should be his last term. But if there's an amendment, if something changes, he could wind up being a three-term president.